So we're back to our 12 days of Christmas, and today it's the third day of Christmas. So on the third day of Christmas, the Beatles gave to me 3 bass players. So the first bass player in the Beatles was John's mate from art college, Stuart Sutcliffe. Now, so much has been written about Stuart, of saying he couldn't play it, he always stood with his back to the audience, he wasn't plugged in. At the very beginning when he was learning, yeah, he stood sideways onto the audience, so people couldn't see what he was playing, because he was making it up. By the time they get to Hamburg and they start playing all those hours, Stuart becomes a really competent rock and roll bass player. Now, at that time, playing bass in rock and roll songs wasn't that most difficult of instruments to play. A lot of it was just plodding on a single note. But Stu became a really good, competent rock and roll bass player. And that's attested to my interview with Pete Best. Of course, Pete, with the drums, has to tie in with the bass. And also from Howie Casey, from Derry and the Seniors. Howie played in a group with Stuart, and he said he was a really good rock and roll bass player. Klaus Voormann, of course, their friend from Hamburg, later becoming a bass player with Manfred Mann, Plastic Ono Band, etc. He wanted to be like Stuart. So Stuart was the first bass player in the Beatles. Now, when I published my book, Liverpool, one of the questions I asked was, when Stuart stayed in Hamburg at the end of 1960, who became the Beatles' left-handed bass player? For most people, that's Paul McCartney. Not yet. The first left-handed bass player was Chas Newby. When the Beatles came back and Stuart stayed in Hamburg, they needed a bass player. They had 4 gigs over that Christmas period, so Pete Best, Beatles drummer, suggested his old bandmate, Chas Newby. So for 2 gigs at the Casbah, 1 at the Grosvenor Ballroom, and probably the most important gig in the Beatles' career at that time, Litherland Town Hall, 27th December 1960, the bass player was Chas Newby. That's when they became the greatest new thing. It's an amazing rock and roll band. Nobody's seen anything like them at all. So Chas, very important part in the Beatles story. But of course, by June 61, Stuart's decided to quit the Beatles and concentrate on his art. Now, Klaus Voormann actually wanted to replace Stuart in the Beatles, but that had already been agreed that it would be Paul McCartney. Straight after Paul joins, they're making the record My Bonnie. And what we see from those early times when Paul takes over, then when we get into their recording career, Paul, in a way, reinvents the role of the bass guitar. Naturally, being a guitarist and also playing piano, he wants to do more than just single bass note plodding on a bass guitar. He made it more melodic. He made it more a part of the song, part of the arrangement. And as the 60s went on, his bass playing just got better and better. Now, as Paul has said, none of the 4 Beatles were the best of their instrument in Liverpool. But he certainly changed things. And Paul became such an inventive bass player. That became so much part of the Beatles sound. So on this third day of Christmas, the Beatles gave to us 3 bass players. And of course, we've also got 2 harmonica players and a young man called Jeff Lee. Catch up tomorrow for the 4th day of Christmas.